Are you ready to squeal with delight? This cozy pig coif is a soft, playful, and a great beginner project to bring a handmade costume to your life. Hi, I'm Christina, and I'm a digital pattern maker and a costume technician who loves to help sewists turn their creativity into wearable art that they can wear proudly or share with their friends. If you're interested in grabbing this pig coif pattern and following along with me, you can find the pattern in the link below. Now you can buy just the pig pattern, or you can buy the bundle that has 12 different ears that you can choose from. So you can make the pig today and maybe the elephant tomorrow. Who knows? Whichever you choose, I'm here to help guide you through every single stitch. So let's go ahead and grab some of those pink fabric, maybe they're fabric scraps, thread up your machine, and we're gonna start sewing something really, really cute. Let's start. I'm going to be projecting my pattern out to cut out all of my patterns. So I'm going to use patternprojector.com. This is an amazing resource that helps you calibrate your projector quickly and then switch over to your pattern pieces to get cutting nice and fast. Once I pull up my pattern, I am going to lay out my pink fabric and make sure that I can cut everything that I need out at once. I am going to be lining my coif or hood, so I will need 4 pieces of all of these pieces. This way it'll make it easier to do a full bag lining. I had wide enough fabric that I could fold it in half twice, so I actually have 4 layers that I'm cutting out all at once. It made it go a lot faster. However, this is something that if you do, you want to make sure you are cutting through all of those layers and you don't have one layer that's maybe a little bit short or a little bit askew. And I also love to use a ruler when I'm doing this type of stuff because I can then make sure that my fabric is being pushed flat to my cutting table and not showing me an inaccurate cut line. As I'm finishing cutting everything out, I am making sure that I am either marking the notches with a chalk pen, or because I know I have a 1/2 inch seam allowance in this pattern, I am going and making just a little tiny slice at all of those notches. It'll make a very quick lineup for notches because I'll be able to pull the fabric just a little bit apart and you'll be able to see that notch. Notching in that way doesn't work on all fabrics, but it works on cotton and most stretch fabrics fairly well. So that is what I decided to do while I was cutting out my pig coif. Once the main part of my coif or hood is cut out, it's time to cut out the fun details like the ears. When I'm cutting out these ears, there are certain pieces that I'm going to need to know exactly where on the stitch line I want to be marked. This might be because I'm actually sewing it. This also might be a line gauge. So as I am going through all of my pattern pieces, I am debating on how I want to put it together, and that's helping me determine if I should add a stitch line or a guideline to make sure that I am stitching or placing stuff right on top. For the big ears, I marked my stitch line so that I know exactly where I want to cut. Then along the bottom cut line, I just marked the placement for the inner ear. After marking and cutting one ear, I flipped my pattern and marked and cut my second ear. Once my outer ears were cut, I then moved on to cutting my inner ears. I am cutting 2 layers of all of my ear patterns because I want to bag out the layers. I want them to be easily finished, and bagging them out is the fastest way for me to do that. Again, with my smaller ear, I traced out the inside stitch line and then cut it out, and then cut out a second one as well. One last thing I decided to cut out is a piece of heavy canvas for the bigger part of the ear. I want to do a little bit more structure in there. I was going to cut out 1 canvas piece for each ear so it wasn't too heavy or too thick, but to help give my ear structure to stand up. Now that we have all of our pieces cut out, we're going to move over to our sewing machine and start sewing everything together. I'm going to start by sewing the inner ears together around the curved edges so that I can bag it out and then top stitch it onto the main part of the ear. I'm going to start by backstitching at the beginning, going up and around, following the curve that I have marked out, and then I'm going to backstitch at the very point. But what I'm going to do at the point is I'm going to do a single stitch over, so it's not coming to a point, but it's going up, one stitch over, and then down the other side following the curve again. This will make it easier for when I'm flipping it. It will make it so that I can actually put a point turner in there and it'll look more pointed once it is bagged out and flipped. Whenever you're doing points like this, I always recommend to have that little flat stitch, that single stitch across, because it's going to help make it easier to get that point to look really pointy. When I am sewing, I always like to batch sew. I sew as much as I can and then move over to my ironing board and iron everything and then come back to my sewing machine. So while I'm still here at my sewing machine, I'm going to sew up the lining of my coif. I'm going to sew my side to the center back piece on both halves of the coif. I am also going to do this with the full-on outside. I don't have different lining fabric than my fashion fabric, so it really doesn't matter which piece is which yet. However, if you do have different fabric for your lining and for your fashion, it's something to note. As I'm sewing these pieces together, I'm first lining up the edge, ensuring that the notches line up. I am then back stitching and starting down and sewing at a 1/2 inch while manipulating the fabric, making sure that the two cut edges are even with each other all the way down as I sew this 1/2 inch. Now, if you do not feel super confident in sewing without pins, I highly recommend pins. A lot of times I use pins. However, on this project, I felt confident enough that my notches were lining up super easily and I could easily get my edges to line up around these curves that I chose not to use pins. Once I have as much sewn as I can before seams start to cross, I'm going to move over to my ironing board and start ironing. I'm first going to start with that inner ear that I sewed first, and I'm going to clip the corner and clip all of the excess fabric away. I always cut with that 1/2 inch seam allowance and then trim it away because it's so much easier to deal with a 1/2 inch seam allowance than cutting closer to an 1/8 inch seam allowance when at the beginning and then trying to deal with that under my sewing machine. Once I have them trimmed down, I'm going to flip them to the right side and use a point turner to really get that point nice and crisp. Once I have the edges kind of pushed out and the point pointed, I'm going to use an iron to really press it flat. And once I have the first inner ear done, I'm going to move on to the second. We're going to trim away the excess fabric. We're going to flip it to the right side, use a point turner or a pencil is what I'm actually using here to get that point nice and pointed and the curves flipped out. Then we're going to give it a good press. I'm going to set those ears aside next, and I'm going to press open all of my seams that I sewed for the coif or hood. This is the center front seam that you could have put on the fold. When you are pressing curves like this, having a ham is an extremely useful tool. It makes it so you can more easily get your seams to lay flat because you can have it curve around an area that you are trying to iron. So I always recommend, if you do not have a ham, I would highly recommend you getting one because there are so many curved seams that having a ham will help with. It doesn't even have to be this extreme of a curve to really help. I commonly will use hams when I am ironing my darts. And remember, you're going to want to iron both your lining fabric and your fashion fabric. Next, we're going to place the inner ear onto the outer ear. I marked at the bottom where this should line up. However, you can do this visually as well. I'm going to go ahead and just pin it on, and I'm pinning it on to both the outer fabric first and then the canvas. I'm going to use this to flatline the canvas to this outer ear a little bit so that I'm still working with it as one. If this seems a little bit too complicated to you, you can flatline the outer ear to the outer ear canvas, and then you don't have to worry about stuff flipping on you or doing anything weird. But it is small enough that I did not find that necessary. Once I have it pinned, I'm going to go ahead and stitch down that inner ear and do the exact same thing on the opposite ear. Pin it down, then stitch it in place, and then I am ready to make the full ear. I'm going to add the other part of the ear, lining up the edges, and I'm going to stitch around, back stitching at the beginning, and then at the point do a single stitch over so that I have that extra room for when I turn, go back down the other side, again back stitching at the point and at the hem, and then it is ready to flip. So before I move to the ironing board, I am going to do the other ear as well. Stitch all the way up, single stitch over, and stitch all the way down. Then I'm going to move over to my ironing board and I'm going to trim away all that excess fabric. It's going to make it much smoother and more clean when it is finished. So I'm trimming all of the seam allowance down to 1/8 inch. Then I'm going to flip it right side out, use a point turner or pencil to get the point to be very pointy and kind of crisp up all those edges and give it a good iron. Then we are going to repeat on the other ear. Trim everything down, flip it to the right side, use a point turner or pencil to crisp up the corners and push out the curved edges, and give it a good iron. Now we're back at our sewing machine to place the ears. This could be a really good time for you to try on the half of the coif to make sure you're happy with the ear placement and make sure that it is either symmetrical or if you want it to be asymmetrical. This is a really good time to make sure you're placing them exactly where you want them. We're going to place them on the fashion fabric. You're going to want to make sure that the inside of the ears are facing forward so that you don't have to redo it accidentally. I tried on my coif and kind of helped with a placement. I then pinned the ears on, and then I matched up the center front of the back of the coif with the center front of the front of the coif. After pinning that, you can either start sewing there, or I moved down to the end of my coif, lined up the edges, and started there. I sewed a 1/2 inch seam from the bottom of the coif up and around the crown of the coif, making sure that that center front seam stayed matching. You will want to do the exact same seam for the lining part of the coif. Match up that center seam at the top, go to the bottom, and sew that seam. Now we have our outer hood and our lining part of our hood. Before we marry them together, we're going to want to attach either ties or the center front closure, whichever you choose. On my piggy, I decided to put some ties on. I first started by melting the ends of the ribbon so that the ribbon would not continually fray. I then placed the ribbon at the bottom of my hood and then rolled up the extra and pinned it to the inside. I like doing this because then it helps contain the ribbon and I don't accidentally sew over the ribbon in another spot that I don't mean to. Once I have the ribbons pinned on both sides, I'm going to line up my two hoods seam to seam, and then I am going to sew all the way around my hoods. I'm going to start at the center back and move a couple of inches away from that exact center. Then I'm going to sew all the way around, back stitching at the corners so that I have a little bit more strength right there on the corners. And as you get close to that ribbon, you want to make sure that you don't accidentally sew over where you don't mean to. I also like to do a little bit of a back stitch right over my ribbon. Make sure that that is solidly together. And it gives it just a little bit extra strength because you will be pulling on that part quite a bit. Then as I work my way all the way around, I am going to stop so that I have at least a 5-inch gap because we're then going to flip everything right side out. Before we flip everything right side out, I do need to clip my corners. I want to clip these corners so that they flip much nicer and can become a very crisp corner. Next, I'm going to start flipping my hood to the right side, and I'm going to start with the points. So I'm going to flip the points out using a point turner or a pencil. I'm going to make sure they're nice and pointed. Make sure my fabric is very thin, so I want to be extra careful not to poke my pencil or point turner through the seam or through the fabric. Then once I have the points all flipped out, I'm going to flip the rest of the coif, move over to my ironing board, and iron everything. Ironing everything is going to make everything look so much better, so make sure that you take the time to iron. Having a ham during this process is going to be a very handy thing to have because we're going to be working all around curves around this hood, so having that ham is going to make ironing so much easier. While you are ironing, make sure that you flip the extra seam allowance of your opening to the inside and iron the seam allowance all to the inside. We don't want any raw edges in the end, and after everything is ironed, we're going to move back to our sewing machine and do a top stitch all the way around the edge of our hood. This will also close up that center back opening. And now it's back to the sewing machine to do the final top stitch. I like to line up the edge of my fabric with somewhere on my presser foot to give me a guide so that I stay the same width away from the edge all the way around. As you are sewing, make sure you are not accidentally running over any of the ribbons so that you don't have to seam rip and redo. Once you are done sewing, it's time to try on this adorable piggy hood. I absolutely love how cute it is and how it turned out. And there you have it. Your pig coif is complete. Slip it on, strike a pose, and get ready to squeal with pride. You have made this adorable look from scratch. You've turned a few simple pieces of fabric into something adorable, and I hope you are so proud. If you'd like to make this pattern, remember you can get it from the link down below, and you can get it just as the pig coif, or you can buy the bundle where you'll get a few more animal ears, some horns, and you would have more options to make different animal ears later after you make this adorable pig. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe. That way you can see more fun creative costume projects, some more animal heads, some sewing tips, as well as digital pattern drafting. I look forward to seeing you in some of my other videos. Happy sewing!